Hello, my name is Lauren. Welcome to the Omnivorous Bookworm. Today I'm going to do my wrap-up for July 2021. It is currently the beginning of September 2021, so I am quite late, so I apologize for that. We actually moved during the month of August, so we moved cities and we moved from one city to a new city while we were living in a third city, or I was staying in a third city for a while. So my husband had to go back, and it was a mess. It was a mess. It wasn't a mess. It was fine. But it was logistically difficult. My husband did all of it. I didn't do a lot. So for him, it was much more of a mess. But we were just in different places and moving and everything. So I'm behind. But I will get back up to speed here, and we will do July. So for the month of July, I read a total of 14 books, so it was, considering, it was pretty good. I had an average rating of 4.1, so it means that I was liking the books that I was reading, so I'm happy with that. And as far as how it broke down, the lowest rated book I have is a 2.5 stars. That was one book. One book got 3 stars. 3 books got 3.5 stars. 3 books got 4 stars, 3 books got 4.5 stars, 2 books got 5 stars, and 1 book got 6 stars. So I use 6 stars for any book that I think will be a favorite for the year or a favorite of all time. Obviously, it's not set in stone, and it's just my own rating system, so that's what it means. I read a total of 3,951 pages, which broke down to an average of 282 pages per book and an average of 128 pages per day for the month of July. The average age of my book, it was really old, was 73 years old, which makes sense because it was Jane Austen July, and I read a lot of quite older books. Even when I read classics, it's usually Victorian. So as far as like breaking down, the oldest book I read in July was from 1794. I also read a book from 1814. I read 2 books from 1817. I read 1 book from 1871. Oh, I just realized this. I didn't read any books from the 20th century. That's interesting. The next, I had 1 book from 2011, 1 book from 2015, 1 book from 2016, 1 book from 2018, 4 books from 2019, and 1 book from 2021. So that's why that happened. As far as my genres, for classics, I read a lot of classics. I read 5 classics. 1 was Gothic, 1 was epistolary, and 3 were romance. So that was all for Jane Austen July. I read 3 books that were romances, that were contemporary. I read 2 mysteries. Those were both cozy contemporaries. I read 2 nonfiction books that were both about historical nonfiction. For sci-fi and fantasy, I read 1 book that was a historical fantasy. And I read 1 short fiction that was what I would consider literary horror. For reading diversely, 7 out of my 14 books were written by people who were not white or straight or what have you. So that breaks down for 50%, which, I mean, I'm just trying to keep that in my mind so that it's something that I'm conscious of and trying to improve that. It's not like it's a, like, ooh, good for me. It's not like that. All right, countries where the books took place. I like to keep track of this because I find it very interesting to learn about or to make sure I'm reading books from a variety of different countries, and hopefully at the end of the year I can see how many different countries I've read books from. This was quite a UK heavy month. I read 6 books that were set in the UK, which I'm sure Jane Austen July has a lot to do with that. 4 books were set in the USA. 1 book was set in France and Italy, both. One book was set in Trinidad, which was, I think that's the first book I've ever read from Trinidad. One book was set in Mexico, and one book was set in Canada. So, all right. And then as far as where I got my books from, I got one book was an audio that was not Kindle Unlimited. I purchased 3 ebooks, and I got 1 ebook for free. I had 7 Kindle Unlimited. 3 of those were Kindle Unlimited ebook only. Can't talk. And 4 were Kindle Unlimited audiobook and ebook. So that was nice. Alright, so getting into my lowest rated book. Straight 2.5 stars for The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. I have a whole review of this book on my channel, so I will link that down below if you would like to watch it. I'm glad I read it. It was a slog, but you can check out that video if you're interested. As far as my 3-star books, that was the Jane Austen Handbook, a sensible yet elegant guide to her world by Margaret C. Sullivan. I talk about that book in my mid-month check-in, so you can look at that down below if you're interested in hearing about that. That was my nonfiction for Jane Austen July. For my 3.5 stars, I have Lady Susan by Jane Austen. This was an epistolary novel that Jane Austen wrote, but it was published after her death. I talk about that in my mid-month check-in as well. So if you're interested in that, check that out. My next 3.5 book is Sweethand, #1 of Island Bites by N.G. Peltier. It's a contemporary romance that is set in Trinidad. I talk about that in my mid-month wrap-up, so if you're interested, you can check that out. And my last 3.5 star books is Breezy Friends and Bodies by Anne R. Tan. This is a cozy mystery. I have read several of Anne R. Tan's books before. She has like 2 series. In both of her series, the main sleuth character is an Asian American female. And I think, yeah, both of them are set in the Northern California area. And all of her, and both of the series that I have also include a grandma, the same grandma figure who's quite feisty and quite funny. She says very crazy things all the time, which is I enjoy. So this book is set in, like I said, Northern California, and it's around Chinese New Year. So I enjoyed seeing that. I enjoyed seeing the Asian American community, like some of the traditions that they have for Chinese New Year. Of course, it's funny. It's not like you don't want to read this book as like to learn about Chinese New Year. I'm not saying that, but I just like that as sort of the backdrop. I enjoy books that have unusual holidays as backdrops, or holidays that I'm not familiar with, I should say. A lot of the plot points for this story are quite crazy. Like, they talk kind of about cannibalism at one point, so give you a heads up if that's something, but it's not described, or like nobody's doing that or anything like that, but it's like just mentioned. So just to give you sort of an idea of like how sort of off the wall some stuff gets in these books. But when you're reading it, it's not like it's absurdist. It's everything's making sense. The plot hangs together. The mystery part of the book I felt like was well written, but not particularly surprising. Maybe a little bit. That's a personal thing, obviously. But I enjoy the characters in all of Anne R. Tan's books. Usually when I read her books, I feel like it's solid, it's fun. None of her books have been like my absolute favorites as far as cozy mysteries go, but I enjoy it. Like, it's just fun to read and fun to kind of, if you're looking for a book to escape, and a mystery, but a mystery that's not going to, remind you of the real world in a lot of ways. I mean, it's not, there's no fantastical elements, but it's just so sort of different, like different than what happens in real crime stories, if that makes sense. That I would be surprised if somebody actually, was upset by the book or anything like that. It's more about the puzzle and the sort of silliness of what's happening with these people, and especially the grandma character. I feel like the grandma character for sure makes the books always. And these are the Reina Sun mysteries. This one, and I like Reina Sun. She's pretty funny because she has like this really kinky curly hair, and everybody's always mentioning it. And she talks about how people expect you know Asians to have very straight hair, and she comes in like with basically like a fro or an afro, although she's Asian. So, but people will like make comments about that, like thinking that she like, perms her hair or whatever. And I think that's funny, like the way she talks about it, and some of the characters' sort of insecurities and her crazy family members. I like those books. All right, moving on to the 4-star books. I have Anonymous. This is number 4 in the Disorder series by Uzodinma. Uzodinma. Sorry, can't talk to Iweala. And that's a short one. I talked about that in my mid-month wrap-up, so you can check that out. My second 4-star is Lemon-Filled Disaster, number 3, Eugeena Patterson by Tyora Moody. I also talk about that in my mid-month wrap-up if you're interested. And my last 4-star book was Persuasion by Jane Austen. I did enjoy it, obviously, because I gave it 4 stars. I read it for Jane Austen July. Of the 3 Jane Austen books that I read for Jane Austen July, I think Persuasion was my least favorite, which was surprising because I expected it probably to be my most favorite. That being said, I still gave it 4 stars, so that kind of gives you an idea of what I thought about the other 2 books. I enjoyed Anne Elliott's character. I enjoyed some of the, Jane Austen always has a lot of insight into class issues and marriage life, and it's never just a straight up romance, which I always appreciate from her. And this one was sort of like a second chance romance, and I liked that. I liked that the characters were a little bit older. I mean, not old, but like, for a romance, especially at that time. They're not so young. They've changed, and talks about, how people can change as they get older, even if it's gradual, the sort of the maturity level, how those people, settle into themselves. And I always find those types of characterizations very interesting, especially how Jane Austen dissects them and talks about sort of the Navy at that time, which I also found interesting, having read the historical, like the nonfiction historical for Jane Austen July, where they talk about the Napoleonic Wars and how important they were, and how many young men were killed in those wars over that period of time, which I felt like helped to give more insight into the military at that time, and what exactly was happening with the British Navy. And just a reminder that because I think when you read about it in books, you just have this idea that they're on ships. Like you forget, so at least I do. They forget, like, oh yeah, they were actually, fighting, and would have been scary. And so I found that also interesting in thinking about how the main character obviously would have matured on ships, but also that the main female character is maturing and coming into her own, and really gets into how, as you get older, you have to adapt your own opinions, your own ideas about things, and you can't just accept what your family thinks or what your parents have taught you. You have to decide for yourself, because your decisions have your own consequences. They're not consequences for them. And I really liked how Jane Austen explored that, and really that those ideas are quite timeless, and that we all have to do that, you know, whether we lived in the early 19th century or the 21st century. We have to, you know, we are responsible for what we decide for ourselves. So I like that. Okay, so getting into my 5-star books, I have Courtship and Marriage in Jane Austen's World by Maria Grace. I talk about this one in my mid-month wrap-up, and I also have a video where I talk about different Regency facts that I learned, and most of those facts came from this book, so I will link both of those videos down below so you can check that out. The next 4.5-star book I have is I Think I Might Love You, The Love Sisters, #1 in the Love Sisters by Christina C. Jones. I talk about this book in my mid-month wrap-up as well, so if you would like to learn about that, I love Christina C. Jones as always. #3 for my 4.5-star books, I have Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. So this was the middle book of the Jane Austen that I read in July. I really liked Fanny Price. I thought it was interesting because there's so many different takes on this book. Like, I was reading sort of how Mansfield Park has been interpreted by different people at different times, and it really does seem to be a mirror of what people want to find in Jane Austen. So people who want to see Fanny Price as just, you know, a really good person, really sweet, you know, sort of the Cinderella figure, in an extremely moralistic story, they will read Mansfield Park through that lens. People who want to see Jane Austen as a feminist who is turning everything on its head and making everything satirical will see Mansfield Park as sort of making fun of all of these tropes and throwing them under the bus. And I guess that's what I found the most interesting about the book, is that Jane Austen doesn't really tell us. It's not like Northanger Abbey where it's clear that it's a satire. It could be a satire. Jane Austen obviously was quite witty, and, you know, since this is one of her later books, it could have been her making a more subtle satire while also still catering to the commercial market, because obviously she wanted to make money. I think one of the most sort of compelling for me details that would lend to that reading of Mansfield Park is Fanny Price at 2 points. She specifically, well, her uncle comes back from what they refer to as the West Indies, where he would have had slaves, and so, or would have had work with plantation. I don't know exactly how the money worked, but he was making money off of slavery, basically. And so they're living in this big house, and everybody's talking about, you know, how this family is and how moral, and they're making all these sort of moral statements, while the patriarch is getting money from slavery. And so at 2 points, Fanny Price specifically, she asked her sort of uncle, paternalist father figure, you know, how are things with the slave trade going, or something like that. But she asked it very straightforward. She's not criticizing him. She's just seems very, you know, just one of those women who would be very meek and mild and very personally moralistic, but then would turn their head at actual, you know, human cruelty. And then when she goes to talk to Edmund about it, she repeats, and she said, I asked my uncle about the, you know, slave trade, and no more is discussed about it. There are no further mentions about that. But we do know that Jane Austen was an abolitionist, and she we have in letters that she wrote about, reading people who were abolitionists and had very strong beliefs about that. So she wasn't just an abolitionist, like, yeah, I think it's a good idea. It was something she had thought about, read about, discussed in letters with other people. So it would have been something that she had strong opinions about. So for me personally, I tend to believe or feel that this was more satirical, but she couldn't take maybe quite as many chances because she was making money at this point and maybe wanted to not rock the boat, if you're thinking more that long around that line. Or she just sort of wanted to poke holes in it and sort of plant that seed in people's mind, like, oh, you see that big house there and all those people trying to be very moralistic. Fanny Price at one point doesn't even want them to put on a play because, oh, well, that would be scandalous and that's, not moral. While in the meantime, while they're putting on this play that would be considered so scandalous, the patriarch of the family is literally doing like human trafficking. So, and that's where all their money is coming from. So this family that's considered to be so upright and so, can be so helpful is literally their bread and butter is coming from this institution. And Fanny Price's family, who's considered poor, their family is arguably, or unarguably, I should say, much more moral because they're not engaging in that type of institution. And so that's my personal understanding of where I fall as far as reading it. But, I will be interested to hear what other people think who have read Mansfield Park, if you think it's just a straight up reading or you think it's subversive. I mean, all of Jane Austen's works are subversive to some degree. So it's really not a fair thing to say. I would say it is subversive at some points. It's just, where do we draw that line with Jane Austen, and where is it a straight story? Because I do believe that she likes the romance. You can see she likes the characterization. She likes those, and that's why you can't make Jane Austen's work as simplified as, oh, this is pure satire or this is a pure romance. She's in the gray. She's always in the gray, and I think that's what makes her interesting. And that's where it's not always clear where she lies, because she doesn't make Fanny Price horribly stupid or horribly silly like she does in Northanger Abbey. So anyway, that's all I have to say about that. For my 5-star books, I read Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I really love this book. I was surprised. It's an interesting book because it is historical and it's fantasy, but it's not historical fantasy in the sense that the past is changed. It's not like an alternative past. It is instead a story set in the past, but it has these fantastical elements. So we have the main character is Cassiopeia, and she lives in the Yucatan in Mexico in the 1920s, and she has a very abusive family structure, and then she ends up traveling throughout Mexico and a little bit of the southern US with a Mayan god. So it's a quite interesting story how that goes. I was a little bit nervous going in because I had heard really good things about Silvia Moreno Garcia, but I also, I don't know, a lot of times when you read stories, especially when they're set in Mexico in the past, it's just very boiled down, very oversimplified, a lot of stereotypes, and I was nervous, especially since it was a fantasy and it's dealing with indigenous cultures and indigenous gods. I was kind of like, oh dear, I hope it's good, because if it's not, it's gonna be bad, really bad. But she does a really great job. I think she does a great job of showing the diversity of Mexico, which is my adopted country and where I've spent the last 8 years of my life and will hopefully spend the rest of my life. And showing, like when they talk about the Yucatan and places like that, and the Mayan culture is very, very distinct. It's very different than any other part of Mexico. But it's probably the parts that a lot of people have visited because of nice beaches and things like that. But she takes the train, she goes into Veracruz, and she goes up to Mexico City, and then she even goes into Baja. I really liked hearing the descriptions when she goes into Mexico City, because she describes some neighborhoods that are quite sort of trendy now, but like the way that she describes them is like these people who have money and who want to make it look classy but don't really know how, so they just throw all these different styles at it. So I really appreciated that. Kind of like dig at that culture, or not the culture, that neighborhood in Mexico City. And I don't know, it is a journey story. I don't tend to like journeys as much. I think this story does a pretty good job at it. But I don't know. I just, every time I feel like when I'm reading a journey, it's just like, okay, get to the next, get to the next. And it's harder for me to enjoy each step along the way, if that makes sense. But I liked how it was done. And I think if you're going to do a journey story, this one worked pretty well. I'm still conflicted about how I feel about the ending. I think that's why I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. I think I was expecting the ending to be, I don't know if I had an ending in my head that I thought it was going to be, and it wasn't that. So I don't know if I was just disappointed or if I thought my ending was better. I don't know. Let me know down below if you've read this book, how you felt like the ending was. But I mean, I gave it 5 stars, so obviously I liked it. I think if the ending had been different, I would have given it 6 stars. It's a really intense book. Like when you're reading it, it's really intense. What I think that she does really well, so if you are Mexican or you're familiar with Mexico, you'll find so many little things in the book that will add so much to it. Like she talks about eating bolillo, which is like a type of bread. It's kind of like a French not a croissant, a baguette. It's like a baguette, but not so long and not quite as crispy. But usually, like we will eat those like every day. People go to the bakery to get fresh bread in Mexico usually, and you will always get bolillo for like one or like 1 peso usually, or maybe 1.5 pesos. Depends on the bakery. And so when she talks about eating the bolillo, and she talks about her huaraches, like which are like a shoe, which well, it can be a food too, but in the case that the author was talking about, the huaraches is it's like a sandal that a lot of indigenous people will wear in different areas of Mexico. But if you're not familiar with those things, like you're not gonna lose out. You'll just be thinking like, oh, what is that? And if you find a word that you're not sure about, and you read this book, I would just recommend to look it up, because it's interesting. And she doesn't add so many things. It's not one of those books where it's like word. It's just like little things here and there. And the story is still really well done. So if you're not interested in Mexico's history or something like that, like you can still enjoy the book, I think, and it would be a good story. It's just if you are interested in other countries or in Mexico or in like histories of other countries, then I think it will just add that extra layer for you, because it's not a thing that you see well done in a lot of books. So it makes me want to read Mexican Gothic, but I haven't yet. All right, my last 5-star book is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, which I talked about, or I did a standalone review. Yeah, I was like, I don't think, when did I talk about that? I did a standalone review, which I'll link down below. And then as far as my 6-star books, I have Aisha at Last by Uzma Jalaluddin, and it is a very loose retelling of Pride and Prejudice. set in Canada in modern times, in the Muslim diaspora. Like, I believe most of the people in the book are like the South Asian diaspora in the Muslim community. And I really like Ayesha. I think she's the perfect Lizzie Bennet. I really enjoyed it. And then I liked Khalid. He's much more religious and sort of uptight. He you know he's a really good Mr. Darcy. Like, he is prickly. You start to see him start to come out of his shell, he's obviously prickly in different ways from Mr. Darcy. So I would definitely, if you're going to read the book, go in knowing, like, it's not Pride and Prejudice. It's its own story, which is good. Like, we don't want to, like, exact retelling of Pride and Prejudice in modern day, because I don't think it would work as well. Hafsa is Aisha's cousin, and she is the Lydia equivalent. And she's just really well. I mean, she's a brat, but she's well done. She's a well done character. And the guy that she goes off with, also as well. I liked that part of it. I think it was really well done. I liked seeing the different, like, the diversity within this community at their mosque. So you have, like, economic diversity, you have religious thought diversity. So, some people are much more strict religiously, other people are much more open. They're not, or especially some of the younger people are just hanging on by a thread. You can tell, as far as their, like, religious observance goes. And I found it all really interesting. It deals with Islamophobia in ways that I think are fascinating, especially because it talks about different ways that, like, there's a Khalid, the way he dresses, he chooses to have a long beard, and he dresses in clothes that he feels represent himself, that are more traditional. And so in his workplace, he gets judged a lot, obviously, as a man looking that way. And then even people within his own community are like, why do you have to dress like that? You don't have to dress like that. So I thought that was interesting, that he's sort of getting it on both sides. And then he has to decide for himself, to stay true to himself, or, like, at what point is he really doing it to stay true to himself, or is he maybe subconsciously doing it as, like, a fu to people, and maybe it's not as necessary as he thought it was, and he has to sort of grapple with that internally and come to his own idea and his own perception of how he wants to present himself to the world while still staying true to his beliefs. So I really liked that. I liked all the characterization. It was just one of those books that was really fun to read, but also interesting. And I felt like, I mean, I can't say that, but, like, it was nice to see different representation, and even within that representation, a wide variety. But the story is the main thing. It's not like, the story isn't just a vehicle to explain things to you. It's not nonfiction. It's a story first and foremost. So I thought it was really well done. I really enjoyed it, and I can see why it was so popular a few years ago. So that is my wrap up for July for 2021. Let me know what you're reading down below. If you've read any of these books, what you thought about them. And please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.